Many observers were caught off guard when Belarusian autocrat Alyaksandr Lukashenka was invited to China for a 3-day state visit. But the reasons for the visit are coming to light. While Belarus appeal more Chinese investment is obvious reason for the visit. War in Ukraine is a common concern both Lukashenka and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. According to Belarusian authorities, during his trip, Lukashenka approved China's 12-point proposal for a ceasefire between Kiev Moscow and signed a series of bilateral agreements in the field of trade technology, totaling $3.5 billion. But timing of visit, amid U.S. allegations that Beijing is considering providing military aid to Russia, sparked speculation that trip was an opportunity to chart a diplomatic course for year-long war in Ukraine. What are your conclusions about the visit and on what ground do you think it should be seen? Ostensibly, it was more about the economy, trade, investment, car manufacturing and further development of some joint ventures, such as Great Stone Park, the large Chinese-funded industrial area outside Minsk. But you really don't need a 3-day visit from a head of state to do all this. With a few exceptions, Lukashenka rarely travels abroad, and she needs a good reason to travel all the way to China and spend so much time abroad. Especially considering all that's going on around Belarus. So it makes it difficult to shake off the suspicion that this visit is really about the war in Ukraine. This also came just after China announced its so-called peace plan. This plan, in my view, implements a set of principles or things it wants happen rather than a real blueprint of how to get from here there. But this is an important Chinese diplomatic intervention, and I think it heightens China's anxiety about the war and its desire to end the war as soon as possible. Lukashenka also has compelling reasons to want the war to end. In particular, it wants to resist Russia's growing pressure on Belarusian forces and stop allowing Belarus to be used only base Russian forces and launch Russian attacks. So this trip is interesting because we see the two countries closest to Russia, China and Belarus, come together and publicly say they want the war to end as soon as possible. I'm curious your thoughts on the timing. As well, some speculation that this trip is perhaps about exploring options for Belarus to help China circumvent sanctions and send military aid Russia. Belarus is feeling the pressure of Western sanctions and needs help, trade and investment from China. But sending aid to Russia via Belarus pushes things in a very different direction and risks escalating the war by equipping Russia with new supplies. Doing so would certainly not help end the war. And I guess it ultimately depends on what Chinese priorities are. We've seen these American concerns that China may be preparing to not only help Russia's economy, but also supply its military with things like ammo and drones. So far there is no evidence that I know of this happening. And if it did, that would be a very serious step. At the moment there is little to suggest that China can somehow supply weapons to Belarus for Russian use. This doesn't make much sense to me. If Russia and China are going to do this, why not give them directly to Russia? There is no particular reason in my mind for Belarus to be involved, and they will have to pass through Russia in any case. Another consideration is that Xi Jinping is expected to make an official visit to Moscow later this year, which was recently telegraphed by Putin himself. So, is Lukashenka's visit some kind of preparation for this? It's hard to say, of course. But Lukashenka, as a frequent visitor to Moscow, made some eccentric comments on February 16 that Biden will be visiting the area soon and would be happy host a meeting between him. Putin went to Minsk to end the war. I don't think Putin is particularly pleased with these comments. But I think this raises some questions about Lukashenka and how much maneuver she has to do these days. Minsk has always been dependent on Moscow. But after Putin came to his aid in the wake of the 2020 protests, he is more grateful than ever. So how much room does Lukashenko actually have to engage with Xi right now as an independent leader? After that, he continued to burn them in various ways, with things like diverting the Ryanair flight and flying immigrants to put pressure on the Polish border. So his position is definitely much weaker than before, but still not a puppet. It still has room to maneuver, and there are still some things from Russia it can resist, of course. This room may be more limited than in the past. What is harder to say is how much of this trip to Beijing was made independently of Moscow, or whether Moscow served a purpose they had established. If you're in Beijing, you're taking 3 days for state visit with the Belarusian president amid a long list of priorities at home and abroad. So you wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't important to broader agenda. Although it's really hard to pinpoint at this point what exactly could be. This interview has been edited and summarized for clarity.